War Between Worlds, Chapter 22, A Successful Party. They rejoined the party after that, hand in hand. Eunice winked at Rook from across the room. They made their way across the hall, and the same Apollonite that had danced with Jen earlier approached them. He bowed.
You have not yet introduced me to your partner, Jen.
Blonko, this is Prince Albrassix of Apollo 1. Al, this is Rook Blonko, my partner. Al bowed and shook Rook's hand.
It is lovely to meet you. I understand that tonight is special.
Jen shrugged. To humans, yeah. It's the start of a new solar year. Earth successfully made another rotation around the sun without getting destroyed. I consider it a good thing. They laughed. Someone tapped Jen on the shoulder, and she turned to find herself face to face with someone else she knew. Kai! Jen hugged the other girl. She was dressed to the nines, too. Her dress was black, simple but elegant, with red heels matching the belt around her waist. Her hair was up in a braid, her bangs artfully tousled. She grinned at Jen. Technically, it's Dame Kai Green now. Jen snorted, but Kai nodded. Gregory and I both got knighted over Christmas for our efforts against the incursions. By the actual Queen of England. You should have seen my mom's face. Jen pulled her into another hug, laughing. Congratulations! I did hear about you both kicking ass against the incursions. Is he here too? Kai nodded over to the refreshments. The ex-Forever Knight turned and smiled at them, 2 glasses in his hands. He made his way over to them and handed one of the glasses of punch to Kai.
It is good to see you, Jen.
Jen grinned. You too. She took Rook's hand and smiled. This is Rook Blonko. Blonko, this is Gregory and Kai, some old friends of mine. Though it's Sir Gregory and Dame Kai now, huh? They laughed, and Rook raised an eyebrow. Jen stifled her laughter.
I do not understand. Why is this funny? Is that not a high honor?
Rook asked. Jen nodded. It is. It's funny because Gregory used to be a member of an organization that called themselves Knights, and now he's a real one. They chuckled, but Rook saw something change in Jen's face. There was a bit of melancholy there, as though this joke had dragged up some old wounds. She shook it off after a moment, though, and looked up at a clock that was set up to count down to midnight. They had about 5 minutes before the final countdown began. We should grab something to toast with. We'll see you around. They nodded, and Jen took Rook's hand, slipping off to the refreshments. He frowned slightly, but he knew that there were too many people here to ask about what Jen was feeling. She grabbed 2 crystal flutes of punch and handed one to Rook. He couldn't help but think. Jen didn't talk much about her past. Most of what Rook knew about it was from her file. He was reasonably certain that he knew which organization Jen had been talking about, though. The Forever Knights. They hadn't been heard from since 2 months before he and Jen had met. The Knights had been a long-time enemy of Jen's from when she first donned the Omnitrix, but information about their demise was sparse at best. All the plumbers knew was that an all-out war had broken out between a group called the Esoterica and the Knights. A war that had left all the participants dead. The only known living Knights had been in plumber custody when the incursions invaded. Driscoll and his men had not been among those who'd escaped custody during the incursion occupation. A few Knights were still unaccounted for, but by all appearances, their legacy had ended in that fight, and no one knew why. Well, no one but Jen, and maybe Kevin and Gwen. But he would not ask here. The DJ stopped playing, and a man that Rook recognized as the president took the stand.
It is lovely to see so many faces here. As we recover from events of the past 2 months, we must focus on unity more than ever.
He continued with a practiced speech. Jen didn't seem to be paying attention. She did join in, though, as the countdown to the new year began. But she was distracted at the last moment as she looked across the room.
Jen?
He followed her line of sight and blinked. It was the same woman from before, her white hair gleaming under the lights. She caught their eyes and fingered her necklace before a tall man walked in front of her, obscuring her from view for only a moment. But when he moved, she was gone. Jen frowned.
Jen? Who was she?
Jen shook her head. I'll tell you on the way home. She turned back to him and raised her glass. Happy New Year, Blonko. He smiled lightly and tapped his glass gently to hers.
Happy New Year, Jen.
The party wrapped up quickly after that. Jen retrieved her car from the valet. She took a deep breath as she drove down the road. After another one, she spoke. Where to start? Eunice. She's not human.
Yes, she did tell me she is a prototype Omnitrix.
Jen nodded. Sweet kid, though. Jen shook her head. She doesn't get out of the lab much, but Azimuth must have thought she was in danger from malware, which, thinking about it, makes sense since she's technically a machine. But never say that in front of her. She's not an object and hates it when people refer to her as one. Rook nodded.
That is understandable.
She was probably on Primus when we faced off with malware. Rook frowned, but before he could ask, Jen launched into an explanation of what Primus was. He nodded. No one can know. It's a pretty closely guarded secret. Rook smiled.
I am glad you trust me enough to confide these things in me.
Jen nodded. Well, number one, you've proved that you're trustworthy. I noticed you didn't put that whole mind control thing in the report when we caught Vilgax last. I appreciate it. Rook nodded. Number two, you're probably going to need to know some shit that isn't in my file as my partner.
That makes sense, but why are some things omitted from your file?
Same reason you didn't put in the mind control. It's too dangerous for someone to get a hold of the information. She shrugged, then sighed. Some stuff is in the private file I'm sure Grandpa has shown you by now, but... She shook her head.
Your friend Gregory, he was a Forever Knight.
Jen sighed and nodded. Sort of. A squire. He quit when he realized what the knights were. Helped me free an alien that looked like a dragon from them.
What happened to the Forever Knights?
Jen shook her head at his question. Story for another time. Rook nodded. Even if he'd earned her trust, some stories would need time to be told.
The woman with the white hair, then?
Jen's frown turned contemplative. Charmcaster. Bit of a long story, honestly. Jen sighed. We had a thing.
A thing?
Jen laughed lightly. A fling. She had just switched to the good side. I needed intimacy after the last time Kevin went crazy. She shook her head. I almost killed him. I almost crossed the one line I promised myself I would never cross. She helped me pull myself back together.
But why was she at the party?
Jen shook her head. I have no idea. Probably gate crashing. I don't think Earth authorities are aware of Legerdemain. But what bothers me is why she didn't talk to me. Rook tried to mention his short conversation with the Enchantress, but his mouth wouldn't form the words. He frowned. Jen shook her head. I will never understand magic users. And yes, I am including my cousin in that. Rook laughed. All thought of telling Jen about speaking with Charmcaster forgotten. Chapter 23. Prior Engagements. Life in Bellwood had mostly gone back to normal by the 1st of January. The rest of the world was still on the road to recovery, but Bellwood had always been good at recovering from alien shenanigans. That afternoon, though, Technorg and his crew were leaving, and Jen insisted that she be there to see them off.
We cannot convince you to come with us, smallest warrior?
Technorg asked, and Jen shook her head. No, she said, glancing back at where Rook was waiting for her. I think I'm good here, thanks. He nodded.
If you ever have need of us, all you must do is call.
Jen nodded and hugged the Detrovite around his neck. Thank you for everything. You'll keep an eye on each other? She asked, glancing over at Ta.
I promise.
Jen hugged her lost transformation and stood back, watching as the ship launched. She stepped over to Rook, grinning wide. So, you ready to head out on patrol? Jen asked, and Rook nodded. On their way to the newly rebuilt proto-truck, they received word that an alien was downtown robbing a jewelry store. Jen laughed lightly. Some things never change. Meet you there. She spun the dial on the Omnitrix and transformed into Accelerate and ran off. Rook laughed, racing to the truck to catch up with his partner. Taking down Festina was surprisingly easy, but as they were loading her into the truck, a TV in a nearby window caught Jen's eye as Rook pulled the Incursion's head out of the wall it had gotten stuck in when Jen had taken apart the armor. Jen frowned as the sports coverage came on. The newscaster was speaking about a local sports star, Julie Yamamoto, coming back into town. Jen frowned, pulling out her cell phone. There were no new messages. Rook looked up, loading Festina into the proto-truck as she openly flirted. He turned, expecting to find Jen getting into the truck. She was still in front of the electronics. Jen? Jen turned to him and frowned at Festina, calling him Little Rook. Would you mind taking her to base? I'm going to return the necklace Festina took. Then I need to pop by the tennis courts. Rook peered over Jen's shoulder and nodded. Of course. Tell Julie I say hello. Jen grinned and squeezed his hand. I will. She took off for the jewelry store with the stolen necklace in hand. Rook got into the proto-truck and took Festina back to base. He frowned when he reached the base, though. There was a Kraho there, wrapped in so many layers Rook was amazed they were still shivering. He handed Festina over to the plumber working intake and stepped over to the shivering Kraho. They bowed slightly. He didn't recognize them, but apparently they recognized him. Agent Rook, I am Kratz of the Kraho. Chieftainess Esther has sent me to beg the aid of the plumbers. Rook frowned. What is happening? The hotspot is under attack. Esther has gone seeking Gen 10, but sent me here in case she couldn't find her. She is an expert tracker, but Gen 10 is difficult to track. Rook nodded. I will come to assist you as well. Kretz nodded, and they hopped in the proto-truck. Jen returned the necklace and took off to the tennis courts as Jetray. She touched down and grinned at Julie, who bounced over to her as she transformed back to normal. Jen, I was going to call you later today. Jen returned the other girl's hug and grinned. I was wondering why you hadn't told me you were back in town. Jen pulled back from the hug and frowned. They weren't alone. He was a tall blonde. He was cute, wearing a tousled button-up and tan jacket. Around his neck sat a camera. It looked expensive. Jen, this is my boyfriend, Hevre. We met in France. Jen smiled and reached out a hand to shake. Hevre shook her hand. It is lovely to meet you. Julie speaks very highly of you. He spoke with a thick French accent. Before Jen could reply, a voice echoed from the top of the stadium. Jen thanked the Proteans. Jen turned and spotted Esther of the Kraho standing at the top of the stadium. The pink girl stretched down to the floor of the stadium, and Julie raised an eyebrow. Who's this? Julie asked. Julie, this is Esther, leader of the Kraho. Esther, this is my friend Julie. Esther's smile was a little strained. It's lovely to meet you, but I need Jen's help. My people are under attack. Jen blinked and nodded. Turning to Julie, she nodded again. It was good to see you, but I gotta go. Come over for lunch. Mom would love to see you again. She turned to the dial on the Omnitrix to accelerate, picked up Esther, and took off in a blur. Hevre shook his head slightly. You have odd friends, Julie. Julie nodded. Odd but badass. Jen pulled to a stop near the entrance to the hotspot and set Esther down as she transformed back into herself. They ran the rest of the way. Jen could feel herself beginning to sweat already. It was extremely warm here. It was probably a good thing that Rook wasn't here with her. Even more so when she spotted someone she had been hoping she wouldn't see for quite some time. Princess Luma Redwind was the one laying waste to the hotspot. She spotted them as they rushed into the hotspot. A smile broke over her face as she spotted Jen. Beloved! Jen swore under her breath. Esther stared at her incredulously. Beloved? Esther sounded beyond disbelieving, more incensed. A voice from nearby piped up, technically betrothed. Jen didn't take her eyes off the Tetraman princess. Yeah, Rook, rub it in. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted her partner's frown slightly as if confused. Jen shook her head. I'll explain later. Luma, what are you doing here? Well, beloved, I am collecting the traditional Tetraman bridal gifts. Something conquered, something bruised, something severed, something blue. I already have something severed, so I thought since you conquered these people, one of them would be perfect. I didn't conquer anyone. We came to a peaceful agreement. After a fight, Luma pointed out. Jen rolled her eyes. Luma raised two of her hands as if brushing off the point. It still counts, love. Now who is the leader here? Esther stretched across the distance to stand between Luma and her people. That would be me. I won't let you touch my people. Esther squared up and Jen spun the dial on the Omnitrix. She selected Heat Blast and she, Rook, and Esther all lunged at Luma from different sides. I would love to dance again, beloved, but I need to collect these gifts. The Tetraman blocked Esther with one hand, slapping her into Rook's path instead, and seized Heat Blast with two other hands. Can this form survive lava? Yeah, Jen realized that it was very stupid, that was a very stupid thing to say, as soon as Luma grinned. The princess threw her like a rag doll, sending her splashing into a large pool of lava and sinking like a rock. It was a little like the consistency of jelly, which was odd, but she had other concerns. When she surfaced, Esther and Rook were gone, and so was Luma. Jen brushed the excess lava off herself, careful to get all of it before she transformed back. She did not want to still be covered in lava as a human. Once she was sure she got it all, she changed back into herself and fished her communicator out from under her shirt. Pierce? Jen, how'd you know I was back today? I know everything that happens in the base, don't ask how. I need a track on Rook's badge, and a bolo out on my rampaging Tetraman fiancé. Pierce snorted, trying to suppress his laughter. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? You heard what I said. I need that location ASAP, please. She pulled her key fob out of her pocket, racing out of the hotspot and clicking the button to summon her bike as she went.